guys. The room is muted on my end. There we go. There we go.
1, 2.
Yep. Okay. All right. Appreciate it. Good morning, everyone. I called order the February 2023 meeting of the Audit and Compliance Committee of the University of Minnesota Board of Regents. Thank you for everyone who's able to join us, those of you in person, as well as those watching the live stream and attending via Zoom. First, let me welcome our student representatives today, Hal Johnson from the Morris campus and Brandon Yang from the Rochester campus, who is on the Zoom. With that, we also have Regent Tao Urabe joining us via Zoom. Wanted to note that as well. So with that, we'll jump straight into our agenda. We have 4 agenda items. First is the external auditor's review of completed audit work. For this discussion, we're going to welcome our controller, Sue Paulson, as well as our team from Deloitte, Judy Dockendorf and Nicole Hoyam. And yeah, they will present, they're going to outline compliance audits as well as some agreed upon procedures, which they have completed for us. And whenever you're ready, Controller Paulson and team, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Regent Kenyanya, committee members. As you provided a brief summary, Deloitte will cover the compliance work that they've completed since the last meeting of the Audit and Compliance Committee in December, as well as the reports that were issued between the time periods. So with that, I'll turn it over to the Deloitte team.
Good morning. Thank you, Chair Kenyanya and members of the Board of Regents. We're happy to be here this morning. I'm Judy Dockendorf, Managing Director from Deloitte & Touche, who leads the work that Deloitte provides to the university. And as mentioned, I have Nicole Hoyam with me. We will start by moving through a review of the completed audit work that we have. So you do have a number of audit reports in your materials, and we'll walk through some communications related to those. Here's a quick summary of those services, compliance-related and agreed-upon procedures that have been completed, and then one that is still in process here. We'll walk through each of these. So the first item that we'll walk through is the federal compliance audit. This relates to federal dollars the university's received over a number of grants during the year. A single audit or a compliance audit is required when more than $750,000 have been expended under federal awards. The university actually expended about $1.2 billion in federal awards, and that's over thousands of award agreements here in fiscal 22. That number's up about $90 million as well as compared to fiscal 21. The university does continue to qualify as what is called a low-risk auditee, and that's really driven by annual audits that are completed and there being no significant deficiencies or material weaknesses identified and no compliance issues. So the university continues to meet that qualification here for fiscal 22. Here's a snapshot for you of the programs that were actually in scope for our testing this year. So we tested 7 major programs. If you've been on the committee for a while, you recall that we do test research and development and student financial assistance every year. Those are significant dollar amounts, and the research and development cluster actually increased quite a bit here in fiscal 22 as compared to prior years as well. There's a few programs that continue to have expenditures from a COVID pandemic-related stance. The Education Stabilization Fund, the Shuttered Venue Operations Grant, and the Provider Relief Fund are really COVID-driven dollars that the university has received. Within these programs, we go through and make selections of expenditures that have been made to ensure they're in compliance with the grant agreement. We look to ensure that they were reimbursed appropriately and that any reporting that's driven by the grant agreements is appropriately completed. We issue an opinion that comprises each of the major programs, and that's an unmodified or a clean opinion for each of those. We did not identify any significant deficiencies or material weaknesses in those programs, and no instances of non-compliance or findings or question cost. We then perform additional procedures related to state federal aid that students at the university receive. So we do an examination by campus. We look at each of the 4 campuses and make selections of students to determine that they were eligible for state financial aid that they received, and that amounts were appropriately dispersed to them. We do issue 4 separate reports, one for each campus. Those were issued back in January, and there were no findings noted related to the state financial aid that students receive. Then we have a few agreed upon procedure engagements that we do. So the first being the one for the Twin Cities Athletics Department. This is done on an annual basis and is required by the NCAA for all Division I institutions. The NCAA outlines the procedures to be performed, and so we follow that guide. And our procedures include work around revenues that the NCAA, or that the Twin Cities campus has received, expenses, so we look at coaches' salaries, travel expenses, various items that go out there. And then we look at both capital assets and debt that are associated with the athletics department. We additionally confirm activity with booster club organizations to understand dollars that came in or went to those booster club organizations. Our report was issued in December 2022. One exception was noted related to an equivalency calculation. You can see there was a difference of just 0.01. That difference was remediated or adjusted for by the athletics department, and there were no issues with overall compliance. We then, on a biannual basis, so every other year, look at regenerative medicine agreement with the Mayo Clinic. And here we go ahead and make selections of expenditures that have been made and ensure that, again, those are in compliance with the grant agreements. There were no issues noted here, and our report was issued in January. And then a new engagement for us here in fiscal 2022 is over certain of the university's retirement plan agreements. So the faculty retirement plan, optional retirement plan, and 457 deferred compensation plan. This is at the request of management, just given some of the transition moving to a new trustee, and just from a governance perspective, management requested that we perform certain agreed upon procedures that they've outlined for us. Those procedures include making selections of participants in these plans, determining that they were eligible to be in the plan, determining that contributions made on their behalf or by themselves were appropriate. Any distributions going out or loans made were in compliance with the terms of those plan documents. Because this is new, this engagement has not wrapped up yet, but our procedures are in process, and we have great assistance from management as we move through these procedures. That is the end of our summary here for the remaining items for fiscal 22. Would be happy to answer any questions before we move on to talk about 2023.
Are there any questions?
Regent Davenport.
Thank
Regent
you.
Davenport, please.
Thank you, Chair Kenyanya, and thank you, Controller Paulson, and for the report. I want to just express appreciation to the university community for their commitment to accountability. I think I was looking through this, and then on the news it had the story about the federal offices and the lack of accountability, and got to thinking, well, across the country, people are accountable. Institutions like this, which are large and have a lot of money, and having seen issues from the local level to the federal level myself, I think that the expectation is set at the top, and that's done here at the university, and I think that it permeates the institution. Of course, there's always some here or there kind of little misses, but I just really believe this university is accountable to the funds that it receives, and it's reflected in these reports and every report I've seen since I've been on the board. So I just want to express that appreciation. Thank you.
Thank you, Regent Davenport. Seeing or hearing no other questions, I think we'll
Regent
move on
Rocha.
to. Okay, thank you, Regent Rocha.
Thank you, Chair Kenyanya. And just following that, and to be the Eeyore on the board, I just want to say that I'm also always pleased and impressed with the reports, but as the constructive skeptics, which is what board members are supposed to be, historically, as I've watched higher ed over the last few decades, places that end up with big issues, oftentimes you go back and their audits were all clean up until the point in time that the big issue comes up. So we must remain diligent in protecting these assets and appreciate both the internal and external resources, and basically, go get them and, and make sure that we continue with that commitment. So I appreciate all that we've done. I appreciate the clean reports, but I always just stay on guard because it's a lot of money and a lot of trust from the people of the state that we're overseeing this very important institution. So thank you.
Thank you, Regent Vice Chair Rocha. Mr. Langworthy, anyone else?
No other questions, Chair Kenyanya.
All right, thank you. Thank you for the presentation. With that, we'll move to item 2, external audit plan discussion. I think we're just swapping Controller Paulson for Director of Iola. And you may begin whenever you're ready.
Thank you, committee members. This morning, we are going to discuss the fiscal year 23 audit plan, and with that, I'll pass it over to the Deloitte team.
And I will have Nicole walk you through our fiscal 23 audit plan, which is hard to believe it's already here, but we'll get started thinking about the June 30, 2023 audit.
Thank you, Judy. So under our generally accepted auditing standards, the purpose of an audit, again, is to obtain reasonable assurance that the financial statements are free of material misstatement, whether that's due to fraud or error. Materiality is a concept that we use to determine what we think is important to the users of the financial statements and would be significant enough to influence their decisions. From an internal controls perspective, we test design and implementation of controls over the financial close and reporting process. However, we do not extend our testing to operating effectiveness testing in order to take a control reliant strategy for our substantive procedures, as it's not required for this size of an audit engagement. For the internal audit function, we do review all of the internal audit reports that come out to help guide our risk assessments. However, we do not use their direct assistance to perform our procedures. So we're required to communicate any significant risk that we've identified. And a significant risk is an audit area that requires increased focus and attention because it's either judgmental, complex, or has a susceptibility to fraud. As of the date of our planning communication here, our identified significant risk is the risk of management override. Now, this is a presumed risk across all entities that's required by our auditing standards. Our planned procedures to address this risk include journal entry testing to understand the business rationale of various transactions. We test design and implementation of financial close and reporting controls. We hold inquiries with management and other members across the organization to get their perspectives on fraud and fraud risks. And we also perform testing over any sort of accounting estimates to evaluate whether there's any bias. And should a significant unusual transaction arise, we would evaluate the accounting treatment of that. With respect to our other attestation services that we plan to perform for fiscal year 2023, we'll have the Ruminco statutory audit that's required by their local insurance regulations. We've got the Uniform Guidance Grant Federal Compliance Audit that we just gave the results on for the last fiscal year. Again, the Minnesota Office of Higher Education examination for state grants. The annual agreed upon procedures for the NCAA for the Twin Cities campus. And then for Division II NCAA institutions, those require an agreed upon procedure every 3 years, and we will be performing that for the Crookston campus this upcoming year. With respect to the planned timing of our audit and other attestation services, we'll kick off our planning, risk assessment, and interim substantive procedures in the spring and early summer. Then we return in the fall for our year-end field work, and we'll issue our audit report towards the end of October. For our other attestation services, we anticipate issuing our reports for those at the end of December 2023 or into January of 2024, consistent with past timing. And I will open it up for any questions.
Thank you. Any discussion from the committee? I see and hear none. Mr. Langworthy, is that correct?
That is correct, Chair Kenyanya.
Okay, well, we appreciate the overview, and I think the silence is a signal of approval, and you continue to do good work for us, and it is crazy that we're already talking about the next fiscal year. I feel like we just did this thing, but we're pleased to have you back, and thank you for the work.
Great, thank you very much.
All right, with that, we'll move on to item 3, and that is an overview or an update on the university's enterprise risk management program. I think this has been an item of interest for the committee members, and I think this will be a good discussion. And with that, we have our chief auditor, Quinn Galswick, as well as AVP Bonison leading this conversation. Once you are seated, either of you may begin.
Thank you, Chair Kenyanya, members of the committee. Associate Vice President Bonison and I are going to be providing you an update today on the Enterprise Risk Management Program. As a reminder to the committee, we originally presented on this in May of 2022, so this is a follow-up presentation. Our agenda for the presentation is first, we'll talk about ERM oversight and governance. This is going to be mainly a recap of the information that was provided to you back in May of 2022, but I just wanted to make sure that it was fresh in everyone's minds in case there was any questions, et cetera. I'll then turn it over to Associate Vice President Bonison to give an update on the ERM implementation plan, as well as initial scan of risks in higher education and where we're believing the ERM function is going to be housed within the organization, at least initially, and how that will interface with the PEAK initiative. We'll then open it up for discussion at the end. So first, we expect that internal audit and the audit and compliance committee are going to have close involvement with ERM, both as it's being implemented and ongoing. As a reminder, ERM is going to be part of the administration, which I believe is appropriate, but that doesn't mean that internal audit and the audit committee won't have close involvement with it. As part of the implementation, OIA is advising on the establishment of the ERM processes and risks, leveraging our knowledge of the institution and its risks in order to help ensure that it gets off to a strong start. And then ongoing, we expect that the functions are going to be collaborating closely. And part of the reason for that is we want to make sure that they're mutually informing each other so that internal audit is using our scarce resources to hit the largest risks as identified by the administration and the board through the ERM process, as well as when we identify potential issues and areas of risk within the institution, that ERM is properly reflecting that in their assessments of the institutional risk. As another reminder, the Audit and Compliance Committee is responsible by board policy for oversight of ERM. That's why we're here today and why you'll keep hearing about ERM for years to come. So going forward, we expect the exact contours of ERM to be defined as part of this implementation process, which we'll be working with outside consulting partner to do. But there's a few areas that we're pretty confident it's going to contain. First, we expect that it will involve ongoing risk assessments. In order for ERM to be effective, it really has to be a living process that we're continually going and updating the risks based upon the changing landscape of risk that we're seeing. We also expect that there'll be broad executive sponsorship for the ERM program. So this will include some form of an executive oversight committee on the administration side, so that when these risks are identified in various units and areas throughout the institution, that those can percolate up and we can have discussions about what are the key priorities for the institution, what are the ones that may impact the strategic plan, where do we want to spend resources to really try to move the needle on. We also expect that the ERM function will be coordinated with related units, including institutional compliance, information security, and, as previously mentioned, internal audit. And then finally, in all forms, we expect that board and senior leadership will be engaged in ongoing discussions with the ERM program, We really want to ensure that ERM becomes a process that is getting the highest levels of visibility within the institution for it to be effective, and it isn't a unit that ends up having its work kind of buried or something that's more just internally focused. So with that, I will turn it over to Associate Vice President Bonison.
Thank you, Quinn, and good morning. Thank you for having me. So we'll start as just a quick recap, and I know this, again, like as Quinn had mentioned, this has come to the board a few times, but as a reminder, this work is anchored in Impact 2025 under the goal Enhance Risk Management through innovative technology and processes. So to date, a couple of the tasks that have been completed, we had a work group that developed a plan for ERM implementation that was reviewed by senior leadership and approved in 2022. The RFP has been issued and awarded for consulting support for a contractor to come in and help us develop sort of this framework for ERM more broadly for the university. We've made some organizational decisions around ERM home, branding, staffing, and next steps so we can kind of get the ball rolling. And we've developed a position description for an ERM manager so someone can kind of do the work and get in there and help us get this moving. So I know there's a lot going on in this slide, but just to sort of ground us and again why this is important and why this is getting so much momentum across the country, especially for higher education, is so why do ERM? Why start a new program? Why add something else to our plate? Just because there's so much going on in this environment. There are so many environmental factors, internal and external, that affect our sort of health, well-being as a university and our ability to do our mission well. And so you think about the deteriorating facility conditions or regulatory changes or succession planning, recruitment, enrollment concerns, all of these things impact our ability to be successful. And you can't tackle all things at one time. So ERM is a way for us to try to get a handle on these holistically, prioritize them, get behind them in a way that's meaningful so that we're more aligned in a strategic way to tackle all of these environmental concerns. And, and COVID just accelerated these, right? And so they made it, kind of picked up the pace, so these things are changing even more rapidly. So we're not alone. NACUBO posted the top 20 risks for higher education for 2022, and none of these will be a surprise to anyone on the committee. So these are just general categories, but supporting and maintaining the workforce being a big concern and risk factor, and we see that, right, with, it's hard right now, you post jobs and we get sometimes not the response we're looking for. Unemployment's very low, retention, so all those concerns, they're affecting everyone across the country. Meeting students' evolving needs, some of this COVID-related, some of this around, mental health needs, and just a changing group of a student body that trying to understand their expectations and meet them where they are. Providing secure and modern technology, so we constantly worry. I know Bernie's had these conversations around, cybersecurity and making sure that we don't lose sort of the backbone of our institution in terms of being able to do what we do. Uncertain economic climate, which is more broad than just the university, but obviously has major impacts when we look at things like inflation and debt and everything else that weighs in here. And then navigating resource constraints. Again, as a public university, we receive funding from multiple sources, and it's not always consistent, and that makes it very challenging. And so broadly, this is what our peers are seeing across the country. So we're not alone. So then we do a little bit, this is by no means a scientific, it's much more than just a snapshot of we always ask, what is everyone else doing? Or, are we different? Are we unique? So ERM, we think, is about 45 to 50% in most organizations, universities that look like us. So it's not, we're not in or out of the norm. A lot of people are doing it, a lot of people aren't there yet. So we're kind of right there in the middle. So we looked at a couple Big Ten, and we look at Ohio State. They do have an enterprise risk management. They have a lot around their president's cabinet, makes major decisions and sort of owns the process. And then you look at someone like Stanford, who is very mature along the way in their risk management program. They have a whole department that's set up and a chief risk officer and a lot of organization below it. So it runs the spectrum here. There is not a one size fits all. One thing we have seen in doing this work to kind of say, what does it look like and who does it well, is you've got to have leadership buy-in, you have to have strong board engagement, you have to have a framework that ties in your community so that it's an informed two-way process. So ERM and the University of Minnesota kind of backgrounding us to where we are today. Some decisions have been, recommended and acted on to try to get this ball moving. At first, when we did the work group, the conversation was, let's wait, bring in a consultant, and then figure out how this would look at the university organizationally. And as you start to do the work, kind of realize it needs to have a home to kind of get things going. So the recommendation has been that enterprise risk management integrate into university health and safety. And so that will broaden sort of our role and our scope to think again more holistically and to help build this beginning of a program. So one of the reasons we talked about this maybe making sense is it keeps the responsibility in the Senior Vice President's office in Finance and Ops, which we do see as a common theme. We are a system-wide office, and it's very important that this program have sort of systemness. We have folks on every campus, and we feel like we know those campuses, and we want to make sure that we're looking at this from a system standpoint. We also think about the peak principles of not trying to create more silos and another standalone, and so to integrate it into something that's established felt good and made sense. But we have the little caveat at the bottom that this is a new program, we don't have all the answers, and we expect that it will evolve and change as we learn more. Is there anything you want to say on that one before?
Sure. So one thing I may highlight with that is that, to Associate Vice President Bonison's comments, there isn't a one-size-fits-all model. There's a lot of different ways in which ERM is set up at various organizations. In some places that may have several other related units that are part of that, and some it's more of a standalone. And again, what we're going to be wanting to do is working with our consulting partner just to be able to figure out what are the best practices to really make sure that it is getting the sort of systemness, if we can use that term, systemness sort of viewpoint in the right level of senior leadership engagement.
So what's next? So this is sort of taking a 6-page contract and boiling it down to 3 small bullet points here. But as we bring on our contractor, we're going to start right away with updating our risk inventory and trying to prioritize that. So if we think back to the slide with all of those things happening at once, you can't say that 25 things are important and do them well. We have to have really tough conversations about what are those top risks, what are those most current risks, and then prioritize them. And then we'll start thinking, now that we've got this new risk map, how do you mitigate those, right? And so it's one thing to identify them, but then you got to do something about them. And so what do those mitigation plans look like? And then to assign a risk owner. I mean, and that what you hear in best practices, it's really important that someone owns these risks. And many times the work won't be done at that level. And so the provost may own a lot of risk, but a lot of that actual work will be delegated down. And then the third and final piece is sort of the ongoing life structure of this program. And what does that look like? And so what is that reporting structure? How do we engage the right folks, engage the board, engage senior leaders? How do we keep this alive and integrate it with the rest of the university's already standard practices and procedures around compact and strategic planning and everything else, so it's integrated. So that's what sounds like a whole lot of work, and it does, and it's a little scary, but it's exciting. So that's what sort of our next steps are. And I think that's our formal presentation. We had a couple discussion items we threw on here. One of the things we talk about a lot is how to build in systemness, and we really are concerned about making sure we're very thoughtful on not building a plan that just works for the Twin Cities, but it's also meaningful for Crookston and Morris. And so we'd love to hear if there are ideas of how to bake that in. And then we've done a lot of research around benchmarking with public institutions, universities, but if there are other industry leaders from industries where you represent that you'd like us to look at, we would be very happy to do so. So with that,
Thank you very much. Sorry, did not mean to jump the gun.
No.
All right.
Okay, all right. Well, we'll begin with Regent Davenport.
Thank you, Chair Kenyanya. We talk a lot about IT risk management, cybersecurity and such, and that is so big. Is that part of this integrated plan, or is that a standalone attention getter?
Sure, I can start the question. Thank you, Regent Davenport, for the question. Our hope, I think, to make this successful is you have to connect all those pieces. And so the work that they do, Brian Dehlin and Bernie and his team, should still continue, but should continue in an integrated way into this broader ERM group. And by no means does that mean people have to move and shift, but the work we do needs to start to be connected. And so if that emerges as a top 5 risk, which it very likely could, then that would be making sure that they're part of this, these high-level discussions, and that we have this risk owner and that they're at the table. Is there anything you want to add?
Yeah, Regent Davenport. What I would add is that, to your question of is that currently happening, or what is currently happening in that space. So Brian Dehlin's team, University Information Security, does conduct ongoing information security risk assessments throughout the institution. We have an institutional policy that requires compliance with that and requires remediation, post-identification of those risks and issues. So that does currently exist. To Associate Vice President Bonison's point, the expectation would be that as the ERM process matures, those risk assessments are again informing or potentially feeding into the broader ERM assessment.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Sorry, I was speaking on mute. I don't think we'll ever get the hang of that thing. But it's good because I hadn't fully formulated my question. You guys didn't hear what I was saying anyway. Chief Auditor Galswick, you kind of hit on this earlier, but I think now having seen the presentation and had a little bit of discussion, kind of going to bring you back to that. This is obviously an administrative thing and something they're going to own, and you commented that that's appropriate and that's how that should be. Can you then just revisit how then the board and the audit committee uses this, right, and how we interact with this and what our role becomes when this is in place?
Sure, I appreciate the question, Chair Kenyanya. So to dive a little bit deeper in how I'm kind of envisioning that, my expectation would be that the Enterprise Risk Management Program would be providing regular updates to the Audit and Compliance Committee. So as this is set up and matured, that we are, on an annual basis, taking a look at what is the risk registry, what are the high risks that we currently see, do we have treatment plans in place, and potentially even what are the key risks that the administration is looking to devote some resources to really try to move the needle on, over the next X number of years or whatever it might be. And to be able to have that conversation with the Audit and Compliance Committee to get the board's feedback on the big risks that you are all seeing and where you would want those resources to be spent. From an internal audit perspective, what I would expect as this matures is that we'll be developing our annual audit plan in part by we'll continue to do our own risk assessments and taking a broad inventory of the various processes throughout the institution. But we will also pull in the ERM information and say, okay, where are there really critical new risk treatment plans that have been implemented? Where should we be coming in and providing that independent view to confirm that, yes, these treatment plans really are addressing these underlying risks? And then we'll be issuing reports to the Audit and Compliance Committee providing our opinion on how that is operating. So that's kind of how I'm envisioning how this will look. That being said, the exact contours of it will be getting defined here over the next year or so, and we will continue to provide updates to the Audit and Compliance Committee on that, including, and it may be important to highlight, including another presentation upcoming here in May, where we'll talk about the kind of progress of the work after the consultant has begun.
Thanks a lot. That's helpful, and the end state you describe, I think is good, and for the board and the committee to have that as a tool, to use, I think is good. And then try to be an equal opportunity questioner, AVP. So I think for you, I'm kind of going to ask about that discussion question you put up about systemness, and I guess just in terms of design, making sure that we're thinking about what this looks like, across the campuses, and we have a lot of the functions we have at the university exist at different levels, and for good reason, obviously, right? But and I don't know if the appropriate version of this looks like also having risk owners at the campus levels, or and maybe obviously we have a certain risk profile at the university level, but then a certain risk might just not really exist for a certain campus or within a certain unit. So again, I don't know what that end state is like. And obviously we have to have the big system overview up here, but then how does that cascade down? And then, and I guess I don't have that answer for that. I think it's the folks across the system, including them in the design and holistically coming up with that. I hope that's helpful for question 1.
Thank you, Chair Kenyanya, very helpful.
Okay, all right. I think seeing no other questions, we'll move on to our final agenda item. And this is our internal audit update, affectionately known as the Galswick Show. So the chief auditor will bring us home with highlighting some internal audit items. Whenever you're seated, chief auditor, the floor is yours.
Perfect. Thank you, Chair Kenyanya, members of the committee. So the internal audit update begins on page 164 of your docket materials, but I'll immediately draw your attention to page 167, where we provide details on our follow-up results on the essential items from past audit reports. The implementation rate for this period was below expectations at 18%. As a reminder, our expected rate is 40%. And this is a pretty big drop from last period where we had very, very strong results of 46% implementation. I think it's important to note, however, that over 60% of the outstanding items that we have are currently with audits that were first-time follow-ups. So these are our most recent audits. In many cases, they're expecting that the implementation is going to take much longer than the 3-4 months or whatever they may have had in order to implement. In addition, there's really 3 audits that make up the majority of the outstanding items. That's dentistry, veterinary medical center, and energy management. In the case of dentistry and veterinary medical center, they've had some pretty strong staffing constraints, or some pretty significant, I should say, staffing constraints and issues, including at high levels of administration, et cetera. And so we do believe that that has been impacting their ability to implement these control improvements. In the case of energy management, these are very complex, unique systems. They always expected that it was going to take a considerable amount of time to develop controls and processes that often are not following the direct kind of policy recommended processes for addressing the risks. And they continue to make progress on this, but it is expected to take a significant amount of time. Of the outstanding essentials, 48% are past due. That's pretty similar to our last 2 periods of 42% and 45%. Again, of those though, nearly 40% of those are coming out of dentistry, which again is having the staffing constraints. So senior leadership is aware of the low implementation rates, continue to monitor and seek ways to improve the remediation efforts. There are 2 essential items on page 168 that are past the 2-year mark. These are the same 2 items as last period and are expected to have pretty lengthy implementation timelines. So this is the Tweed Museum up on the Duluth campus, and they're continuing the effort to get a complete inventory of their collection. And then in university health and safety, looking to really establish a broader integrated safety training process. So currently that's being done by many different units throughout the institution, and Associate Vice President Bonison and her team are working to try to consolidate that and provide better oversight, which I think is absolutely the right thing to do. It just is going to take some time, and there's additional details on that on page 168. On page 169, there is an update on the collaborative assessment on identity and access management. This is provided by the administration. This is not something that has been directly audited. As a reminder, by the nature of the collaborative assessment and kind of the broad risks that they had identified, we always expected that we would wait a few years and then come back and do an audit to confirm the remediation of the highest risk items. And as an additional reminder to the committee, Bernie Galacek, the Vice President and CIO, and his team will be presenting in May to provide an update on the remediation efforts. Finally, for follow-up, there's 4 audits that closed all outstanding items, and those are identified on page 185. We always want to give them a shout-out. There's a tremendous amount of work that goes into improving these administrative processes to reduce institutional risk. I'll jump back, though, to page 166, which is our introduction to the internal audit update, because there's 2 items I want to highlight there. First, changes to the audit plan. As you may recall, in June, we had set up 2 different tiers of audits, Tier 1 audits and Tier 2. The Tier 1s were the ones that we committed to the committee that we would complete as long as our staffing levels stayed the same. And then the Tier 2 were the audits that we may swap out if risks were to change or if we were to have issues with staffing. We do still expect to complete or initiate all of our Tier 1 audits but by the end of the fiscal year, but there are a few Tier 2 audits that we are going to be pulling off and potentially starting in FY 2024. And that's partly due to some changes in timing of regulatory implementation, as well as some changes in internal processes where we just felt that it would make more sense for us to wait until after those processes have been implemented so we can review the new processes instead of something that's maybe in transition. From a staffing perspective, we had 6 openings over the last year. Again, as a reminder for everybody, we typically would have 1 in a normal year. We've successfully hired 4 of those 6 openings. We do still have open 1 IT auditor position and 1 financial auditor position. However, I'm happy to report as of yesterday, we've signed an agreement on an IT auditor, so we're very excited about that. So when he joins us in March, that'll help us to get our IT audit work done that's on our plan. On page 187 is the audit activity report. It just provides an overview of all the work that we have done over the last period. To highlight the audits that were completed, there was 3 that were rated as good, and there was 1 that was rated as needs improvement. The audit that was rated as needs improvement was RecWell. It's detailed on page 191 of your docket materials. There was just a number of information security and financial operations issues that were identified. This is another unit that has had considerable financial constraints since the pandemic and staffing issues since the pandemic. There's been a pretty significant reduction in their self-generated revenue that they've been able to bring in since the start of the pandemic. 2 audits were rated as adequate. COOC on page 189 and UMD ITSS on page 192. Both of these, we feel that they have sufficient controls in place to adequately address the risk, but in the case of COOC, they just have very high inherent risks by the nature of doing clinical activities. There's a lot of compliance risks, et cetera. So though they have good controls in place, there's just a need to improve those in order to ensure ongoing compliance. In the case of UMD ITSS, they provide a very broad array of services, and this audit was very large. We covered all those various services, and so we found a number of issues. That being said, though UMD's ITSS unit, which is the primary IT unit for the campus, is very important to the UMD campus, they don't necessarily have the same level of risk as maybe some other IT units that are dealing with highly confidential data, et cetera. So that does help to reduce the inherent risk associated with them. On page 194, there's 2 SNAP reviews that we completed, faculty development leave and absence request not process. The kind of details of the scope is provided there. And then on page 195, that is the new schedule that was provided last period on where management in their action responses have identified peak as part of the implementation plan or the remediation plan. There were no new audits added to that schedule this period, but we intend to continue to update that as we go so that we can give the committee understanding of what units are really relying on the peak initiative to address some of their risks. And with that, that concludes my formal remarks, and I stand for any questions.
Any questions for the Chief Auditor? Regent Davenport.
Thank you, Chair Kenyanya and Chief Auditor Galswick. Going back to page 166, and just for clarification, low implementation rate of the outstanding audit items is not reflective of the lack of commitment or high expectations, but rather there is commitment and the expectation for progress is clear?
Regent Kenyanya, Regent Davenport, absolutely. I believe that there is good progress that is being made. I think that, going back to our ERM presentation and what we're seeing as a risk throughout higher education, the staffing constraints are real. And it's difficult to implement new administrative processes and controls while you're still trying to run the operations. And I think that's been a significant portion of the root cause of what has led to the low implementation rate. That, in addition to just the complexity of some of these issues. It's, as we've talked about before, the implementation rate is, I think, a good bellwether, but it's not a perfect metric in the sense there's many factors that feed into that. There are sometimes we have essential issues where, it's related to compliance or whatever it might be, go use Form X. Well, they can start using Form X next week, and that's a real easy implementation. There's some that they need to completely redesign their systems and processes and figure out how they're going to address those risks. So given the nature of the audits that we've had with a higher level of complexity recently, coupled with those administrative constraints that have slowed down some of the implementation, I think that's really the core of it. I don't think it's reflective of a disregard in any way towards the implementation, and I would let you know if it was.
Thank you.
Vice Chair Rocha.
Thank you, Chair Kenyanya. A couple things. On 194, the SNAP review, one of the things that'll happen at higher ed institutions that get a lot of public attention, even though it may be a very, very tiny part of the overall operation, is when the folklore about a faculty member who is on your faculty drawing a full salary, but also happens to have a faculty appointment on the other side of the country, and you find out they haven't lived in your state. These reviews, do you think we would catch that if that was happening at the University of Minnesota? Do we have the safeguards to ensure that you don't have, and certainly the higher up you go in the ranks, the more latitude I think you have to sort of operate independently. Would we catch that if that was happening in Minnesota?
Chair Kenyanya, Vice Chair Rocha, I will let Provost Croson jump in if she wants to, but what I will say is that I believe from a policy and design perspective, we have the right controls designed in order to be able to identify those types of situations where we are expecting reports back from faculty on what did they do during these leaves, how were they using those leaves, how did that map out. Looking at this from the SNAP review that we conducted, I think there's some room for improving the ongoing oversight and making sure that we're consistently getting those reports and consistently reviewing them. But I think we have the right controls in place, the right controls designed, and in order to be able to catch those types of things. Is there anything you'd like to add?
Perfect, thank you.
Thank you, and Chair Kenyanya. In following up, just the reason I bring it up is because those are those things that have such a damaging effect on so many people who are doing amazing work, and yet that'll be the thing that the public will focus on. And so that's why I think it's so important that we're very diligent about that. Two other quick items, if I can, Mr. Chair, unless there's other folks that want to jump in. But on the departures, I find that interesting that we had that larger number of vacancies than normal, especially because I think that, from the general public's perspective, university positions are attractive. We tend to be, certainly in the administrative ranks, we tend to be pretty well compensated, and it's considered to be a good gig if you can get it. So is there anything that we should be aware of that would have caused this unusually large number of vacancies in that context? And would there be anything that we would want to do? Because obviously these are positions that it's essential that we stay on top of this from an accountability standpoint.
Yeah, Chair Kenyanya, Vice Chair Rocha. So there's a couple of factors here. One, I think, is just a larger environmental factor that, the Great Resignation was real. I think coming out of the pandemic, a lot of people wanted to try different things, and there was just a bigger shakeup that occurred. I think there was maybe also a little bit more appetite for taking some jobs that might be riskier. For example, One candidate that we're talking to ended up going with a startup company, right? Where it says, okay, you know, I'm feeling like I want to take some additional risk in my career. I think the salary does impact. We know that as public employees that we're never going to pay the same as, you know, downtown Minneapolis. And I will tell you, we've made a couple of hires recently where people have chosen to take a cut in pay in order to come join us, which is tough. As we've talked about before, I philosophically believe that it's always easier to forego a pay raise than it is to accept a pay cut. But I think some people, you know, are seeing that value in public service and want to be involved in the university and recognize the impact that we have to the community and are willing to do that. But we really do rely on people doing that. If we are just competing on dollars, we're going to lose, and that is the case.
Thank you. Mr. Chair, if I may, or unless somebody else is on the list.
We are on schedule, so.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chair.
Go ahead.
Well, and just, you know, to the extent that the, you know, the prospect that this is my last audit committee meeting in the foreseeable future, I want to say I appreciate the work that the team does. I think that, you know, we have, based on my observation over the last 8 years, a good structure. We make substantial investments in this level of accountability. I do want to urge the committee and the board and audit leadership. I think I would like to see us tighten up the separation. I don't, you know, and we've talked about this before, Chief Auditor Galswick, that there's a difference between our audit function advising the institution versus participating in the institution. So when we have audit leadership or folks in the team involved on a search committee, that takes away the objectivity for the capacity to audit what happens under that position going forward. And you know, recently we had the conversation about the conflict resolution where there's participation. It's not advice, it's participation. That violates my understanding of audit rules. And so we need to make sure that we keep that separation so that when we as a board turn to the audit function, we know that we are getting as objective a perspective as we possibly can. And even though it may never have caused any specific you know, damage to the institution, there is the subjective damage of a question about whether that objectivity is a bright line. It's part of my experience with other public entities where it's considered essential and without question. And so to that extent, you know, it's a, you know, kind of a bittersweet thank you. I appreciate all that we do, and that's an area where I think we can improve it and just simply have a zero tolerance for crossing that line between the advice and guidance from audit and participation in operations that would ultimately be subject to audit review. So thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Vice Chair Rocha. Chief Auditor Galswick, do you have any other comments, or does that conclude this item?
Chair Kenyanya, I would only say that from the internal audit department's perspective, independence and objectivity is the most important factor to all we do. We always need to be seen as above board and need to be seen as a trusted partner for the organization. I take that very seriously. I stake my career on it. I stake the department's reputation on it, which is more important than me.
Thank you. Mr. Langworthy, am I correct that there's no other questions or comments?
That is correct, Chair Kenyanya.
All right. Thank you, everyone, for your time and attention, and all the presenters. I think mission fulfillment will begin at 9:15. Besides that, we stand adjourned. Thank you.